Today I'll teach you how you can create this Apple-style battery animation in Cavalry using something called clipping masks, but more on that later. To start, let's change this background color to a more dark gray, which can be a value of 14, 14, 14. And now we can actually start by adding a shape. And for this, we're going to use a square shape, which we can then add a bevel onto later. But first of all, let's scale it up by using the size parameters. And we can set a width of 770, and then the height we can set to just maybe double that of 400. Next, we can go ahead and look at the corner radius, which is going to give us this bevel. And for this project, I think around 100 is going to be fine. Now, before moving on to adding the next part of this battery, we can change the color, which we can do up in the right-hand corner here. And we can change it to whatever we want. But for this project, I think a value of 5E, 5E, 5E is going to look quite nice and match Apple's overall aesthetic. Now we can move on to adding this knob at the end, which we're going to use a circle or an ellipse for this. And then to make it a half circle, we can go ahead and change this to semicircle. And then we can rotate it by 180 degrees up in this value right here. And then it's just a matter of matching the size to something you like. And for this, I think a value of 50 for the width and then a value of around 60 for the height is going to look quite nice. And then we can just adjust the position to be a little bit closer. Now, these two objects might look like they have the same color, but actually the lip shape is still the default color from Cavalry. So we need to change that, and a way to do that is just to select it and then use the eyedropper tool, which you can find inside of the color here, and we can just select it and then just click on the body you want to copy the color of. And now, before moving on, I recommend just renaming the objects to something that makes more sense, so that when you have a more complicated scene, you don't have like 20 different layers you don't know what mean. So for the rectangle here, we can rename it to base, and then we can group these two into one by pressing Ctrl G while having them both selected. And then we can rename it by pressing F2 to something like shapes. And now we can move on to the more difficult part, which is actually filling up this battery. And one way you might imagine we could do this would be to take the base and then duplicate that and then change the color of this base. And then we can put that into a align behavior and change the X value on the align behavior, then move that base over to the left until it matches the left boundary of the original base. And then we could change the width value. Now it looks good, right? Until you drag it all the way over to the left, where you'll see that it doesn't really look that nice. And the reason for this is partly that we're using the corner radius, and we won't really change that. And also, if we try to drag it all the way over to the right, we can see that it doesn't fill up this knob that we have over to the right here. So we need to do something else. So let's delete that duplicate and the align behavior, and let's add a simple shape, the rectangle shape. Now we can start off by changing the color to what we want the end result to be like, and that is FE, FE, FE. And then we can go ahead and change the scaling, and you'll see that it scales from the center. So we need to add an align behavior and then change the X value all the way over to 1. Now then we can now move that object all the way over to the left, just like we did before. And now by changing the width value, you'll see that it moves like we want to, and it actually goes over the knob, which we actually want. And we want to also change the height so that it goes over the actual height of the base shape, so that we later can cut away all the other parts using a mask. But first of all, let's change the frame rate to 60 frames per second so we can create a little animation. we can select the rectangle shape, and then we can go ahead and set the size to 0 on the width, and then add a keyframe, then go all the way over to 150, and then set another keyframe for 850 width, since that's the width of the whole battery. Then we can go into the graph editor and select all keyframes and change the interpolation to Bezier. So we can now smoothen out the animation by clicking this handle and setting it to something like this. And the other handle we can set all the way over here so that we get this type of animation right here. Now, it does look quite weird that the whole white box is overlapping the actual battery, but I'm going to try to make you understand that. But the way we want to create this animation is that we want to basically have this rectangle, and then we want to cut away all the parts outside of these two battery shapes that we have created. Now, if we go over to the end of the animation, you can see that we have these two outlines of the original shapes, and that's basically what we want to use as the guidelines for cutting away the excess. Now, before we do that, we can organize our layers a bit again by collapsing the shapes, and then we can go ahead and rename the white rectangle to something that's easier to understand, and that can be progress, or in this case I went with indicator. And now we're ready for the interesting part, which is actually making this look like an animation filling up a battery. And for that, we need to use something called clipping masks. And I sort of went over how we're going to do this, but essentially what we're going to do is input a shape into the indicator, which is going to be these two shapes, the base and the semicircle. And what they're going to control is what is visible of the indicator. So if you select the base shape, we can see that we have this outline of the shape, and that's basically what we want to have visible of the white shape. But to make this easier, we need to connect the semicircle and the base into one object. And to do that, we can select the base shape and add a deformer called Boolean. And after you've done that, we can go into the Boolean, and we now have an input field. And in here, we want to drag in the semicircle. So go ahead and do that by clicking on it and dragging it all the way over here onto the clipping shapes text. And then we want to select union, since we want the base and the semicircle to be one. Now, selecting the base, you can see that the base now includes the boundaries of the semicircle. So that's good. And now we're ready to use this as a clipping mask. So we can go into the indicator. Then going to masks, we can see we can input a shape, which is going to be the base shape. Now, dragging this base shape into the indicator's clipping mask, we'll see that it doesn't quite look right now, but it is actually set on the right mode, which is intersect, which basically tells the computer that the white shape, the indicator, is only visible in the places where it overlaps with the base shape and the knob. Now we can see that the base background shape has actually disappeared. The reason being that when used for masks, it unticks the visibility. So go ahead and change that back. And now we can go ahead and play the animation, and we can see that it looks quite nice, but we can take it a step further, adding numbers. And the way we're going to start off by creating this procedural percentage indicator is by adding some text, and then we can align it on both axes. And we can see that it isn't the right color yet, so we can go into the fill, and then we basically just want to copy the color of the background. So go into the background and drag that blue dot over to the color of the text shape, and now it looks nice and has a good contrast. Then we can bump up the font size to something quite large, since we're only really maximum gonna have 3 numbers, and then we can change the font to whatever you like, and then a more bold version. Then we don't want to just change the value 1, 2, 3 manually, but instead add a generator called value. Now this is quite self-explanatory what this is going to do. It's going to assign a value to the string. But first of all, let's organize the whole layers a bit, and we can rename the text shape to something like percentage, and then dragging the string generator into this percentage text. Now going into the string generator, we have a couple of values. First of all, the number, and then we have precision, which we're going to just set to 0 since it's only going to be whole numbers, and then padding is also just going to be 1. And we want to control this number from a range of 0 to 100. And the reason we don't want to just manually animate this from, let's say, frame 0 at a number of 0, and then go ahead and set it to 100 at frame 150, is that, let's say we want to, for example, change the length of the original animation to something faster. We will have to also change that as well, and we will also have to copy the easing. So let's not do that, and let's instead do it procedurally. And the way we're going to control this number instead is by having this be connected to the rectangle size. And if we go into the indicator, we can see that it ranges from a width of 0 to 850. So what we're going to do is we're going to drag this blue dot from the width value into the string generator and then assign it to value.number. And right now you can see it ranges from 0 to 850. And while that's not what we want, on the positive side, we can see that if we change the length of the animation, it automatically changes the text as well. So now to change it from being 850 at 100% to 100, we need to divide it by 8.5. So go into the string generator and we can right click and then add a expression to the number. And we can do divided by 8.5. And now you can see that it changes to 100. And we can now see that by playing the animation, the text matches the easing of the original animation. And we can now move on to this colored version of the animation. And for this, what we're going to do is we're going to make it so that at 100% it's going to be green, at 0 it's going to be red. To do this, we need to go into the indicator, which is going to be what we're going to change the color of. Now you might think that we need to right click and then add a shader, but for this we're actually going to do something else. And to do that, we need to go ahead and add something called a color blend, which is going to blend between two colors or more and basically create this gradient where we for this project are going to use a green color for the right value, and then for the left value we're going to use a red color to indicate that the battery is low. And then to make the gradient look nicer, we can double click in the middle and then we can add a yellow color. Now the difference between this and a regular gradient is that we have this strength value that we can then assign to basically be correlating of the percentage text we have. So we can drag that color blend into the indicator to first of all control the fill color of the indicator, and then to animate this percentage value we can go ahead and control that by the string generator that we've already set up to match the indicator. So we can go into the string generator and then basically just drag this value all the way down to the color blend and then select strength. And now we can see that playing the animation, the colors are exactly that we want them to. And we can see that here in the middle here, it already turns yellow quite early on. So we can just drag the yellow a little more to the left. And now we got the final result. Now, if you enjoyed the video, consider subscribing. And if you want to support me even more, you can buy me a coffee, links in the description. Thank you for watching.